Welcome to another Dumb Things People Say to Atheists. The series I haven't got to much lately because I've already covered so many of them. But please feel free to let me know if you have ideas for new ones. Today we're going to address one that's a pretty basic insult and that you already know is coming because you saw the title. And that is, there are no atheists in Foxholes. I mean, yes there are, but whatever. I guess let's talk about it anyway. The first thing we should address before going on is that this is probably the most figurative of all the dumb things I've dealt with so far. I'd say it's the only figurative one, but then there'd be no end to the hair-splitting and the well-actuallys. Yeah, you know who you are. Even though many of these might use individual words in a slightly figurative way, and most have insinuations that run far outside the scope of the statement itself, the statements as a whole are pretty literal, not requiring people to unpack even the most obvious, direct metaphors. There are no atheists in Foxholes, however, is far more slippery than that. Of course, it's not literally saying that an atheist has never been located in a physical foxhole. In fact, it implies that people can enter a foxhole being or claiming to be atheists. That's kind of the point, right? You might think you're a big, tough, self-reliant atheist who doesn't need God, but stick you in combat and you'll figure it out pretty darn quick. So even on the most obvious level, it's dealing in slight vagary and potential double meaning. Now, I don't say this to be pedantic. I mean, I think or at least hope everybody more or less understands the statement isn't that literal. But the trick is in the more or less part. People might say this while really meaning this, and everybody in the conversation might pretty much understand that, but until you spell out the actual meaning in as many words, it remains unstated subtext running in some nebulous form at the back of their minds. And while that might be harmless when you're dealing with a distinction as obvious as this one, the trick is that a phrase this figurative is likely to have all kinds of other less obvious, poorly considered, and possibly faulty assumptions attached to it. Now, this isn't to say metaphorical language is bad, of course, but it can get incredibly problematic when used as an insult, as it leaves all kinds of room for a person to insinuate things they haven't thought clearly about and, when called out on, can use semantics to deny. I guess that was a lot to say about this kind of thing, but it's a vital aspect of how this remark functions, making it a stand-in for a whole body of insinuation-drenched remarks that tend to get passed around churches. This is a major problem within the evangelical community. A lot of negative ideas about atheists get so deeply embedded in the minds of even well-meaning Christians that many of them take them for granted as obvious truths. These truths are summed up by popular turns of phrase that are effective at making insinuations feel vivid and memorable, but not so great at prompting Christians to recognize in explicit terms what those insinuations are and how much they apply to actual atheists. So repeat these statements over and over in an environment that doesn't encourage deep understanding of atheists, and some pretty unconstructive assumptions can worm themselves into the mind of even the most well-intentioned believer. So that all said, what specific insinuations are being reinforced by the phrase, "There are no atheists in foxholes"? Most broadly, it's saying that deep down atheists actually believe in God. I mean, you don't have to read too far between the lines to pick this one up, right? The closest thing to a literal interpretation of this phrase is that we just try to pretend he doesn't exist, but once the bullets start flying and we're faced with our own mortality, we'll acknowledge him and our need for him. It's pretty much summed up by the scene with that young Soviet soldier in Red Dawn who, despite being an on-screen representation of your average dirty atheist commie, suddenly started calling out to God for help after being shot. I'm not sure how much that was the point of the scene, but boy did my friends from Christian school all latch onto it. And for a period of time this became a popular example in my class of what happens whenever an atheist is faced with death. Now most of that hormone-charged teenage crowd was, not exactly pious, but give them the combination of a violent scene from an 80s action movie and a sharp jab at atheists, and suddenly they experience a burst of rowdy enthusiasm for Team Christianity. Kind of tells you something, doesn't it? Anyway, back to the point. This phrase might not always exactly be saying that we all believe, But at the very least, it insinuates we have enough of a nagging feeling that he might exist that at the moment of extreme distress we would either call out to him in desperation or suddenly worry about the fate of our souls. Now, of course, if Christians were to ask themselves, how likely is it that I'm suddenly going to worry about all the non-Christian ideas about the afterlife at the moment of death, they'd get some idea of how little their idea of the afterlife is going to suddenly concern me. But that's not the kind of self-awareness that Christianity usually traffics in. This leads to the next obvious insinuation, which is that atheists are afraid of death. This serves two functions. First, it criticizes atheism by implying it's an incomplete worldview because it doesn't provide the coping mechanisms we need to deal with our mortality. We might claim we're okay with the idea of someday simply passing from existence, but deep down we need more. In fact, pieces are simply missing from the puzzle if we don't believe in more. A temporary existence is inconsequential, in fact meaningless, so after a life of trying to cobble together the illusion of peace by chasing one bit of temporary fun after another, our death prompts us to panic with the realization that not only is the fun over, but that it all meant nothing. At that moment, facing nothing more than a string of pointless moments behind us and an endless darkness ahead of us, what would we do but suddenly realize our need for the meaning atheism had never given us? Of course, the very idea that a worldview is incomplete if it doesn't provide a pat answer to any form of existential dread is silly in and of itself, but that doesn't keep it from being a major critique of atheism. Second, it criticizes atheists, mostly for ascribing to the empty idea of atheism that I just described. If a view of the world is that obviously absurd, that obviously meaningless, and it doesn't provide any real way to cope with the fear of death, then what does it mean if a person professes it? It can't mean that they, actually believe it. That they're actually at peace with living a brief, moral-fulfilled life and then passing on into oblivion because that's the best choice given the state of affairs as they see it. They obviously must be hiding some other motivation behind this claim stance, be it pride, a desire to sin, or whatever, and they must be suppressing some deep sense of terror about the eventual fate they just want to pretend isn't coming. This probably explains why some Christians think saying, just wait until you die and find out you're wrong, is an effective way to rattle our cages. In short, atheism is simply too absurd to believe, thus we must be insincere when we claim to believe in it, and our facade would surely fall away the moment we found ourselves in a foxhole. At this point, I started drifting toward another insinuation that deserves to be listed on its own, which is that atheism is just a bunch of arrogant but empty bluster. We might strut around acting like we're all wise in our worldly ways, but it's all more or less an act, and all it would take is the right prick of a needle to pop our big balloons. So pride doesn't just motivate us, it's necessary for maintaining our puffed up facade of claimed disbelief. I won't linger on this point because there's not much more to explain factually, but a simple turn of phrase can conjure a whole complicated web of feelings about us, and I'd be overlooking something major if I didn't mention that it's calling us out for pride. Finally, I should bring up that this isn't just about death. It insinuates we aren't prepared to deal with any major crisis. Our arrogant pretense that we can do it without God can only be maintained when our immediate circumstances are comfortable. Because we tell ourselves we can do it in our own strength or whatever, and without true joy our happiness depends on circumstances. You know what it all sounds like. If you could strip away all the metaphor and specifics and get down to the most bare-bones underlying point, the message of there are no atheists in foxholes is clearly not about foxholes as such. But it's also not about death in combat, nor even just about death. It's about the supposed fact that adversity will drive us to our knees and humble us before a God we want to pretend doesn't exist. These are all insinuations that, whether or not a specific person means all of them, are packed into the phrase, there are no atheists in foxholes. It's worth it for us as atheists to be aware of that. So what do we do with this nonsense? To start, let's run through a few of the things wrong with this saying. It's some pretty obvious stuff, but it's worth explicitly itemizing these problems so they aren't, like the insinuations of the saying itself, just sitting poorly defined at the back of our minds. This is probably not comprehensive, but here are a few of the things I've noticed. First is the fact that there's simply no good reason to believe this statement is true. I've never seen anybody support it with any kind of data, which you'd think Christians would eagerly produce if they had it, and it's often contradicted by counterexamples. The most that can be said for it is that it feels a little intuitive, But even then, thinking this burst of panic amounts to the adoption of a coherently considered theistic worldview, and does so inevitably enough to make you assume atheism doesn't survive time in a foxhole, is giving a lot of weight to your gut-level assumptions. The closest thing I could find to a statistic about this was a study finding that service members are 8.9% more likely to pray and attend religious services when in an active combat zone. But considering the fact that only 15.4% attend regularly outside combat zones, despite over 50% considering religion an important part of their lives, the 8.4% figure is easily explained by existing believers getting more serious about their religion. And even then, that's not a super huge increase in religious practice. If combat has that minor an impact on a population that's already religious, then we really have to wonder about any absolute statement that nobody can remain an atheist in a foxhole. This is even ignoring a whole world of possible factors, such as tighter-knit communities and greater exposure to chaplains on the front lines. Second, has anybody considered that this claim isn't even flattering for Christianity? I mean, if I were advocating for a position, I'd want it to be the kind of thing that made sense to someone when they were thinking clearly and had time to calmly consider what I was saying, not something they'd mainly default to in a moment of panic. But the second option is exactly what Christians are boasting about when they say, there are no atheists in foxholes. It essentially amounts to, you might not believe in my religion now, but just wait until you're in a desperate, frenzied state of mind. Is that when you want to tell everybody that your position makes most sense to people? Really? It's as bizarre as saying there's no dry underwear in foxholes to argue that people should start peeing their pants. It's futile and from the outside looks like an unintentional self-burn. Now, this isn't to say that there's no situation in which stress can produce a moment of clarity where you rethink your priorities, but it's not anything to build an entire argument or worldview on. Finally, this seems to contradict something else Christians say happens when a person goes through hard times. As alluded to in my previous episode, Someone Must Have Hurt You, they say that an atheist just stopped believing in God because of difficult circumstances. Yet in this case, they say a difficult situation would make an atheist start believing in God. Now I know there's some potential nuance here. Maybe people react to stress in different ways and, atheists always react in a way that can be summed up with these kinds of condescending remarks? Maybe, but that seems a little too convenient. Even if it's true, I doubt most believers who say things like this discover they were true after exploring various good and bad ways atheists might respond to various situations. Based on my personal observations, I find it more likely that they just reach into a grab bag of existing insults and pull out whichever one fits a specific situation, giving no thought to how it contradicts other insults they'd be ready to pull out in other situations. But, and I can't emphasize this enough, while I see this as a trend, this isn't all Christians. If you're wondering what a Christian means by this or anything else, you should be charitable and ask. This gets to my concluding thought about how to react if you hear someone say this. If you have the kind of relationship with a person where you can communicate with them and would benefit from deeper understanding, be gracious about their intentions and try to dig into what they mean. Because while this kind of comment is rude, a lot of its rudeness resides in subtext that a Christian might not always be aware of. And this is where it can help to think about why so many people so readily accept this with no informed reason to think it's true. Broadly speaking, it does appeal to people's intuition. It even appeals to mind to some extent. Given that most people don't spend a lot of time emotionally processing their mortality, you'd expect them to have all kinds of reactions to being faced with death. But for Christians, the appeal runs deeper. This idea also validates a lot of what they believe about hope in the afterlife and why people react to God the way they do. See, most or at least a lot of Christians aren't just going to whip this saying out to insult you. They're more likely trying to express what they understand about the nature of belief and disbelief based on Christian doctrine. If eternity is on your heart, if God's existence has been made obvious to all of us, if indeed God wishes that none should perish but that all should come to repentance, then what are you supposed to conclude about non-believers? Why do you think they proclaim non-belief, and what do you think they'd suddenly do when brought to their knees at the moment of death? It's easy to see how simply expounding upon what they believe can insult you by insinuation, even if that's not what they intend. So a saying like, there are no atheists in foxholes, might make sense to even the most intelligent, good-hearted believer simply because it ties together a lot of things they already believe, and they might not even perceive the insult. Now, am I saying they bear no responsibility for this? Of course not. Should they introspect more on what sayings like this lead them to believe about others and why? Depending on the person and the level of development, yes. But what do we do with this? Assuming ill intent, or even blaming them for a lack of self-reflection, isn't going to be helpful. I'd suggest a better course would be to ask questions to see what they meant and hopefully, over time, help them to reconsider, to untangle the assumptions that got into their head. That's what I would have wanted someone to do for me when I was a believer, and it will be the most helpful thing we can do in our relationships with current believers. Again, if you have a relationship that would make such a conversation possible and beneficial. If this isn't the case, it will often be better, sometimes safer, for you to just walk away. You can't reach an understanding with everybody, and sometimes trying will get you more trouble than it's worth. Ultimately, that's your call to make based on your situation. But if you can open that door of communication, maybe you can help them see that pithy statements like these, and some of the doctrines behind them, are superficial even when applied to vague hypothetical atheists and totally incongruent with what they know about you as a real flesh and blood person. Hopefully this will help them to understand you just a little better and start to recognize the emptiness of this dumb thing people say to atheists. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.